The strike you didn't know you were throwing. Stop punching the impossible, the simple action that immediately replaces failure. If the impossible pushes back every time you fight it, then what happens when you stop swinging and let the field respond for you? This is the question most people never ask, and it is the reason they stay trapped inside a reality that resists them. They keep striking a wall that only gets stronger, never realizing the wall is built from their own tension. Today, you will discover the interaction that dissolves the impossible in seconds. Not theory, not motivation. A biological, spiritual, and energetic shift that collapses the hidden mechanism behind failure. You will understand why every effort you've made has fed the obstacle instead of removing it. You will see how Scripture encoded this principle as the rest that moves mountains. You will learn the exact neuroscience behind the moment your brain stops fighting and starts receiving. And you will understand why letting go is not passivity, it is precision. If you stay with me until the end, you will gain the ability to stop reinforcing the line of life that keeps you stuck. You will feel the emotional weight drop. You will experience the mental silence that makes the impossible soften. And you will know the action that replaces years of struggle with minutes of alignment. If you leave now, you will keep punching what you could dissolve. You will strengthen the very timeline you were trying to escape. You will continue feeding the obstacle with the energy that keeps it alive. You will repeat the same cycle that has been stealing your momentum, your clarity, and your faith. Chapter 1. The Invisible War Against Reality. Most people don't fail because reality is difficult. They fail because they are fighting it. The moment you tighten your mind around an outcome, your body follows. Muscles contract, breath shortens, the nervous system shifts into mild threat. This is not motivation, this is resistance. The brain interprets effort as danger, and danger triggers the exact patterns that block clarity, intuition, and fluid action. The impossible becomes impossible not because it is unreachable, but because you approach it like an enemy. You punch with emotion, you swing with urgency, you try to break the door that was never meant to be forced open. The internal physics are simple. The more you push, the more the field rebounds. The more you insist, the more life closes. Zeland calls this excess potential. Scripture calls it striving after the wind. Neuroscience calls it sympathetic arousal. All three point to the same mechanism. You feed the obstacle the moment you fight it. You energize the problem every time you meet it with tension. The body sends a signal of threat. The field mirrors that signal back to you. This is why the same situation keeps repeating. You think you are confronting the problem, but you are actually reinforcing it. You give it shape, you give it weight, you give it importance. The impossible grows stronger the moment you try to defeat it. Contrast this with the biblical phrase, "It is finished." Not a cry of surrender, a declaration of alignment. A state in which the battle is over because the inner tension dissolved. "I must force it" is the language of the ego. "It is finished" is the language of the field. One creates resistance, the other creates movement. The war you think you are fighting outside is happening inside, and the moment you stop striking, you discover the wall you feared was made of your own pressure. Chapter 2. The Mechanics of Failure. The Loop of Internal Tension. Failure is not born in the moment something goes wrong. It begins long before that. Inside the loop, your nervous system enters the moment you want something too much. Desire activates excitement. Excitement activates tension. Tension activates resistance. And resistance blocks the very path you were trying to open. The loop feels emotional, but it is mechanical. Once triggered, it runs automatically no matter how intelligent or spiritually aware you believe you are. Every intention that carries urgency sends the same signal to the brain: prepare for loss. The body interprets intensity as instability, not confidence. Studies on emotional arousal show that high excitement narrows perception, limits creative problem-solving, and strengthens old neural patterns instead of forming new ones. You think you're energizing your manifestation. In reality, you're reinforcing a survival script that says, "This outcome threatens me." This is the circuitry behind anticipated defeat. Before anything external collapses, your inner world is already rehearsing the story of failure. The brain does not wait for evidence. It reacts to emotion. If the emotion carries pressure, the mind prepares for impact. The nervous system shuts down openness. The body tightens.
The field reflects the contraction back to you as obstacles, delays, or silence. Effort under tension becomes a prophecy. The more you strain, the more the outcome drifts. Not because the desire is wrong, but because the body cannot move toward what it fears losing. This is why the impossible feels heavier the more you want it. You are trying to climb while dragging the weight of your own nervous system. Scripture echoes this with the warning against toiling in vain. Not because work is wrong, but because striving from fear produces no fruit. Zeland frames it as the collapse of inner balance. Neuroscience calls it resistance to plasticity. These languages describe the same truth. When the inner tension rises, failure becomes the automatic outcome, not because you are incapable, but because the body is serving the story you unconsciously broadcast. Chapter 3. The Physics of Non-Resistance. There is a moment when the impossible stops being heavy. It happens not when you push harder, but when something inside you collapses quietly. Zeland calls this the fall of excess potential. Every ounce of emotional weight you place on an outcome is converted into resistance. The more meaning you assign, the more the field pushes back. The physics are simple. Pressure distorts reality. Neutrality straightens it. Non-resistance is not passivity. It is the removal of the energy that keeps the impossible alive. In quantum terms, a system stabilizes when the observer stops agitating the field with contradictory signals. In spiritual terms, the yoke becomes easy when you stop adding burden that was never asked of you. In psychological terms, the prefrontal cortex regains clarity when the body stops signaling danger. You know this shift by its texture. Something inside loosens, the chest opens, the breath deepens. Your awareness becomes broader, quieter. The outcome stops feeling distant. It stops feeling urgent. It stops feeling personal. This neutrality is not indifference. It is alignment. The tension that once fed the obstacle drains out, and without that energy, the impossible begins to dissolve on its own. Every mystical tradition teaches this principle in different language. Zen calls it non-doing. Jesus calls it peace be still. Zeland calls it allowing the lifeline to straighten. Neuroscience calls it parasympathetic dominance, the state in which the brain becomes capable of reinterpreting reality instead of defending itself from it. These words point to the same movement. When you stop resisting the outcome becomes movable. Non-resistance bends reality because it removes the force that was bending it against you. The moment the internal fight ends, the external world stops mirroring tension and begins mirroring flow. This is the silent pivot where the impossible loses its anchor and begins to shift. Chapter 4. The Biblical Principle. The Power that Works in Rest. Long before neuroscience mapped the nervous system, Scripture described a state where power flows only when struggle stops. Hebrews speaks of a rest reserved for those who understand that effort is not the source of transformation. Jesus demonstrates this principle repeatedly. When storms rise, he does not fight the wind. He speaks stillness from stillness. When crowds panic, he does not match their urgency. His authority moves through calm, not tension. This pattern is not mystical poetry. It is a technology of consciousness. The phrase, "my yoke is easy," is not metaphor. It is a description of a state where the mind is no longer generating friction against the field. Creation occurs through alignment, not pressure. The biblical principle is clear. The power that rearranges reality activates when the inner world is at rest. When Jesus says, "Let not your heart be troubled," he is not offering emotional comfort. He is giving a precise instruction. Do not allow fear to become the signal that commands your reality. Do not let agitation be the voice that speaks to the field. Do not feed the outcome with resistance. Troubled hearts produce turbulent paths. Restful hearts produce straight ones. Miracles in Scripture follow this same geometry. They appear when striving ceases, when fear dissolves, when the individual stops contending with the problem and enters a state of inner stillness. This stillness is not passive, it is potent. It is the moment the self aligns with the deeper field that actually shapes outcomes. The effort that once held the obstacle in place collapses and the path clears. The power that works in rest is not mystical favoritism. It is a law, a universal mechanism echoed by Zeland, demonstrated by Christ, and confirmed by modern science. When you stop fighting reality, you stop reinforcing the version of yourself that keeps losing. Chapter 5. The neurobiology of effortless shifting.
The amygdala, which normally reacts to desire with subtle fear, begins to deactivate. This is crucial. As long as the amygdala is active, the brain interprets your intention as a potential threat. It prepares you for loss rather than for transformation. This is why wanting something intensely makes it feel further away. The body tightens, the mind narrows. Your system enters defensive mode instead of creative mode. The moment the pressure dissolves, the nervous system shifts into parasympathetic dominance. Heart rate steadies, breath deepens, muscles soften. This shift is not emotional, it is physiological, and it changes the architecture of your perception. When the body stops protecting the old identity, the brain becomes able to encode a new one. Neuroplasticity increases, new associations form. Possibilities that were invisible under stress become available. Studies on coherence show that when the heart enters a smooth rhythm and the brain synchronizes with it, clarity rises, intuition sharpens, and the mind begins to access solutions without effort. This is not inspiration, it is biology. Coherence turns the impossible into movement by restoring access to cognitive and emotional resources that stress had shut down. This is the real reason letting go works. Not because the universe rewards surrender, but because your nervous system stops blocking the path forward. The outcome stops feeling like a threat, the internal war ends, and the brain unlocks the capacity to see, choose, and act from a different level of identity. When the body enters this effortless state, the impossible begins to soften. You feel it first as a lightness in the chest, then as a widening of awareness, then as a quiet certainty that no longer needs proof. This is the point where reality becomes malleable again, not because you pushed, but because you stopped contracting around the result. Chapter 6. The simple action that immediately replaces failure. There is one internal action that collapses failure the moment you perform it. Not a technique, not a ritual, a shift so small and so quiet that most people overlook it. It is the deliberate release of emotional continuity. Every failure you repeat is sustained by an emotional thread that connects who you were a moment ago to who you are right now. As long as that thread remains unbroken, the identity that fails continues to operate. The simple action is cutting that thread. You do this through a micro shift in intention, a subtle reorientation that breaks the momentum of the state you are in. When you interrupt the emotional continuity, even for a second, the nervous system exits the loop that was keeping you locked in resistance. You stop rehearsing tension. You stop feeding the outcome with fear. You stop energizing the impossible with the story of, "This is hard." The field responds instantly because you have withdrawn the signal that was maintaining the obstacle. This interruption is not mental, it is somatic. It is the moment you let the body drop the inner contraction. Shoulders loosen, the jaw releases, the breath falls into a natural rhythm. Your awareness expands. This is the point where the creative mind emerges. You step out of the identity of the struggler and into the state Zeland calls the neutral creator. From this neutrality, a new reality becomes available. You shift from tension to openness, from urgency to clarity, from force to alignment. The impossible loses density because you are no longer the version of yourself that kept it alive. The second part of this action is the activation of the creative neutral. It is the state where you want nothing, fear nothing, chase nothing, and resist nothing. This neutrality is not numbness, it is power without pressure. It allows the field to reorganize your path because you are no longer bending it in the wrong direction. To anchor this shift, a single phrase is used not to convince the mind, but to stabilize the body. A phrase drawn from the biblical architecture of non-resistance. Short, direct, unemotional, spoken internally once. It signals the nervous system that the fight is over, and the body obeys. In that moment, failure ends, not because you defeated it, but because you stopped generating the state that sustained it. Chapter 7. How to detect the shift in real time. When the impossible begins to lose its grip, the first changes appear inside you, not around you. The most immediate sign is an internal quiet that feels out of place at first. The noise that usually surrounds the problem fades. Thoughts lose their urgency. The emotional spikes flatten. You are not excited, you are not afraid. You are simply clear. This clarity is not mental, it is physiological. The nervous system has stopped defending the old identity. Another sign is the sudden slowing of the body. Breath deepens without you trying. The shoulders drop. The chest feels open instead of compressed. It is subtle but unmistakable.
The shift creates a physical spaciousness that was not available when you were fighting the outcome. Your perception widens. You take in more of the environment. Your awareness feels softer, not sharper. This softness is coherence beginning to form. You will also notice the disappearance of importance. The outcome stops feeling heavy. You no longer hold it like a burden. It feels lighter because the excess potential that once inflated it has collapsed. This is the moment Zeland describes as entering the flow line. The goal still matters, but not in a way that creates pressure. It matters with the weightlessness of something already aligned. There is also a psychological indicator. Problems that once triggered your defenses no longer activate the same reactions. You see them, but you do not contract around them. You sense possibilities instead of limitations. You can choose without hesitation. Your mind stops arguing with itself. This is the signature of an identity that has shifted out of resistance. And then there are the small confirmations, tiny synchronicities, a message that arrives at the right time, a solution that appears without effort, a path that opens unexpectedly. These are not coincidences, they are reflections. The field mirrors the reduced resistance in your system. Reality responds to the quiet inside you before it responds to your actions. Recognizing these signs matters because they show you that the shift has occurred even before the external result arrives. The impossible begins to dissolve the moment your internal resistance falls. Chapter 8. When the field takes over for you. There is a moment in every genuine shift where your effort becomes irrelevant, not because you stop caring, but because the field has begun reorganizing reality on your behalf. This is not mystical exaggeration. It is the natural consequence of removing resistance from your nervous system. The field can finally move without colliding with your tension. You recognize this moment by the way life starts to respond with a softness that was absent before. Situations that once demanded force begin to adjust on their own. Conversations flow in directions you didn't plan. Opportunities arise from places you never touched. Obstacles weaken as if losing structural integrity. It feels as if life is leaning toward you instead of away from you. This shift happens because the field mirrors internal states, not external actions. When you stop constricting around what you want, you stop bending reality in the wrong direction. The field interprets your neutrality as permission. Neutrality is a signal of trust. Trust is a signal of coherence, and coherence is the only state through which the field can operate without distortion. Mystical traditions describe this moment as action without action. Zen calls it wu-wei. Paul calls it grace. Zeland calls it the path of least importance. Neuroscience calls it the default mode network transitioning into integrative flow. These different languages point to the same phenomenon. The moment you stop punching the impossible, the world begins to shift because you are no longer reinforcing the version of reality that resisted you. You notice something else. Movement appears where stagnation lived. Ideas come that feel placed rather than produced. You are no longer forcing steps. You are being carried by momentum that isn't yours alone. This is not passivity. It is alignment. The actions you do take feel precise, light, and effective. There is no friction, no fight, no internal debate. This is the point where effort stops being your engine. The field becomes the engine. Your job becomes presence, not pressure. And presence creates openings that force never could. Chapter 9. The Paradox of the Impossible. The impossible does not collapse because you defeat it. It collapses because you stop feeding it. Every obstacle in your life is sustained by the emotional energy you attach to it. The fear, the urgency, the obsession, the pressure, all of it forms the scaffolding that holds the impossible together. When you remove that energy, the structure cannot stand. It dissolves, not slowly, not eventually, immediately. The paradox is simple. The impossible feels real only while you believe it has power over you. It grows in proportion to your resistance. It expands in proportion to your fear. It strengthens every time you tense your body, rehearse worst-case scenarios, or try to control outcomes. You think you are confronting it. In truth, you are nourishing it. The moment you withdraw the emotional current that sustains the impossible, a vacuum forms. This vacuum is not emptiness. It is neutrality. It is the absence of the emotional charge that once reinforced the obstacle. Zeland describes it as collapsing excess potential. Scripture frames it as moving mountains through faith instead of effort.
Neuroscience calls it deactivation of the threat response loop.
Each is describing the same collapse. This vacuum is powerful because it reorganizes identity. You no longer stand as the person who fights, fears, or chases. You shift into the one who observes, chooses, and allows. And reality mirrors identity faster than it mirrors desire. When the emotional charge disappears, the field cannot hold the old form of the problem. It begins dissolving it layer by layer, as if the impossible were made of vapor instead of stone. You feel this collapse internally before anything external changes. A sense of distance from the problem, a lack of emotional reaction to what once shook you. A quiet certainty that does not need evidence. This is the paradox at work. The impossible does not fall when you overpower it. It falls when you stop being the version of yourself who needs to fight it. Chapter 10. The identities that cannot manifest. There are versions of you that simply cannot create the reality you want. Not because you are broken, but because identity determines outcome. Every result in your life emerges from the state you occupy, not the desire you hold. And some identities are built on tension, fear, and self-doubt, states that sabotage manifestation before you ever take a step. The first is the striving self. This is the version of you that believes effort is proof of worth. It pushes, it forces, it performs. It feels responsible for every detail, terrified that one wrong move will collapse everything. This identity cannot manifest because its foundation is fear disguised as discipline. The field does not respond to fear. It mirrors it. The second is the anxious self. This identity wants the outcome but doubts its ability to receive it. It checks, it monitors, it spirals. It imagines failure as if preparing emotionally could prevent it. Anxiety blocks manifestation because it demands certainty before surrender. But certainty never precedes creation, it follows it. The third is the controlling self. This version believes the only safe path is the one it can supervise. It distrusts the unknown, it restricts possibilities, it limits fluidity. Control collapses the field into the smallest possible version of reality, the one your fear can manage. Nothing miraculous can enter through a door that narrow. Then there is the disbelieving self. Not skeptical in thought, but closed in identity. This self cannot imagine a version of life where things work. It expects disappointment. It predicts delay. It carries an emotional posture built from past wounds. The field does not override this posture. It reflects it. What replaces these identities is the neutral creator, a version of you that acts without pressure, decides without fear, and allows without collapsing into passivity. This self is not detached. It is aligned. It moves without inner contradiction. It holds intention without tension. It permits the field to respond because it is not fighting itself. The shift into this identity is not intellectual. It is somatic. You feel it in the body first. Lightness, openness, calm certainty. When this identity arises, manifestation stops being a struggle and becomes a natural expression of who you are. The impossible becomes possible, not because the world changed, but because the self attempting to create it finally disappeared. Chapter 11. The moment failure collapses. There is a precise moment when failure loses its authority over you. It doesn't happen when circumstances change. It doesn't happen when opportunities appear. It happens when your internal structure shifts in a way that the old identity can no longer sustain the story of "this won't work." The collapse begins inside long before the external world reflects it. The first fracture occurs when you stop rehearsing the emotional posture that held the problem in place. A kind of inner silence emerges where there used to be tension. You notice that the same thought that used to trigger contraction now lands softly. The old fear feels distant, almost irrelevant. This is not avoidance, it is disengagement. Your nervous system is withdrawing energy from the version of you that kept failing. Then comes the dimensional thinning.
reality feels slightly less dense, as if the path forward has more openings than before. The heaviness that once surrounded the issue loses cohesion. This is the collapse of the emotional gravity that held you in the same timeline. When the emotional charge dissolves, the line of life you were stuck in begins to break apart. You can sense this as a subtle ease in your perception, a quiet expansion that wasn't accessible when your identity was rigid. You may notice small shifts that seem too delicate to matter. A thought that feels cleaner, a decision that feels obvious, a sense of "I can step here" that replaces "nothing moves." These micro breaks signal that the field is no longer reinforcing the old reality.
It's as if the structure that once trapped you has lost its internal support beams. And then, without warning, an opening appears. A call, a person, a timing shift, a solution that could not have entered while you were tense. People call it luck or divine intervention, but it is neither. It is the natural result of exiting the identity that maintained failure. Once that identity dissolves, everything it magnetized dissolves with it. You feel this collapse as a return of possibility. Not excitement, not hope. Possibility. A quiet recognition that the situation is no longer what it was, that you are no longer who you were. The failure did not fall because you conquered it. It fell because you stopped feeding the version of yourself that kept breathing life into it. Chapter 12. The Ritual of Immediate Shift. There is a point where trying becomes the very obstacle. This ritual exists to remove that point. It is not spiritual theater nor a technique to impress the universe. It is a precise intervention designed to break the emotional, neurological, and energetic continuity that keeps you repeating the same version of yourself. The goal is simple. Interrupt the identity that fails, stabilize the identity that creates, and allow the field to reorganize your path without resistance. You begin with the body, because identity lives there first. Sit or stand without posture. Let your weight settle. Notice where tension gathers. You are not relaxing, you are allowing. When even a small portion of the tension softens, the old emotional circuit weakens. This is the first break in the loop. Next comes the mental interruption, not through affirmation, but through discontinuity. You cut the momentum of the narrative you are in. In neuroscience, this is known as a pattern break. In scripture, it's the moment the mind becomes still so the deeper voice can speak. In Zeland's language, it's the instant excess potential collapses. The interruption is only a second long, but a single second without resistance is enough to destabilize the impossible. Then you shift into what can only be called the creative neutral. This is the state where your desire still exists, but without tension. It is a state where nothing inside you is pushing or pulling, where there is no craving, no urgency, no emotional pressure. This neutrality is not apathy, it is coherence. It is the stance of someone who no longer negotiates with reality, but inhabits possibility. From this neutral ground, you allow the new identity to surface, not through imagination or visualization, but through recognition. You sense the version of you who is not struggling, who does not fear the outcome, who stands in the moment as if the path were already open. This identity feels like relief. It feels like clarity. It feels like breathing after holding your chest tight for too long. It doesn't require belief. It requires absence of resistance. Once this identity is sensed, you anchor it with a single internal statement, not emotional, not dramatic, and not repeated. One calm sentence that matches the state. A sentence that signals to the nervous system that the fight has ended. When spoken in neutrality, it installs itself without conflict. It does not bounce off old fears, it bypasses them. Then you stop. No visualization, no forcing, no extension of the moment. You release the ritual the way you release a breath. You do not follow it with action. You do not chase a result. You allow the shift to settle without interference. In this quiet release, the ritual completes itself. The old identity loses momentum, the new identity stabilizes, and the impossible begins to reorganize, not because you moved it, but because you stopped being the person who couldn't. The seal of non-resistance. Before we close, there is one action that anchors everything you've experienced here. A phrase that trains your attention to stop feeding the obstacle and start feeding the alignment. Words don't just describe your state, they imprint it. They direct the nervous system, they signal the field. They become the subtle command that shapes the line of life you enter next. Comment with the phrase, "I stop fighting and the field begins." Write it as recognition, not hope, as presence, not pressure. This simple act reinforces the internal shift you initiated. It strengthens the identity that no longer punches the impossible. It marks the moment you stepped out of resistance and into coherence. The end of struggle. Everything comes back to one truth. Reality is not moved by force. It is moved by alignment. You spent years trying to break obstacles that were held in place not by destiny, not by difficulty, but by your own internal tension. Every punch you threw at the impossible made it stronger. Every attempt to control the outcome tightened the identity that could never manifest it. The struggle was never outside, it was inside. The moment you stopped fighting, something opened.
The nervous system softened. The body released its defenses. The mind loosened its grip. The emotional charge that kept reinforcing failure collapsed. And as that contraction dissolved, the field responded the only way it can when resistance disappears. It began to move. Scripture, neuroscience, and Zeland all describe this same pivot in different languages. The storm calms only when the heart calms. The brain reorganizes only when threat dissipates. The lifeline straightens only when excess potential falls. These aren't metaphors, they are mechanisms, and they reveal the same law. The path becomes clear when you stop blocking it. You have learned how failure sustains itself, how the impossible feeds on your tension, how the wrong identity can sabotage even the right intention. And you have learned the shift that reverses all of it, a moment of discontinuity, a drop into neutrality, a release so small it is almost invisible, yet powerful enough to collapse an entire timeline of resistance. From here, you don't push. You don't force. You don't swing at walls that only stand because you strike them. You move from alignment, not urgency. From clarity, not fear. From rest, not struggle. This is the posture that dissolves the impossible. This is the state that allows the field to do what your tension never could. The end of struggle is not the end of desire. It is the beginning of creation.